Hey everyone, Jake Lloyd-Bacon here.
Along with Paul Bianchi.
And Alexandra Hoy.
Hey, we all host different shows on Dragon Wagon Radio.
We do, but that's not what we're here to talk about.
Not at all. We are here to talk about Dungeons and Dragon Wagon,
a narrative podcast series in which we venture into a mythical land for a D&D inspired role-playing game.
Alexandra and I are joined by Matt Hinksman and a very special guest of quest for each chapter of an epic saga in which we must take on the roles of half-orcs, dark elves, and more as we fight our way through a fantastical land of peril, drama, and often hilarity.
All of which is controlled by me, the Dungeon Master, and the player's chance rolls of the die.
And our show is for everyone. Even if you know nothing about D&D or role-playing games, we've got you covered.
That's right. Our game sessions are highly edited, easy to follow, sound designed from top to bottom, and completely immersive.
Yeah, our episodes sound more like a well-produced radio drama than an RPG show.
So what are you waiting for? Join the adventure on Dungeons and Dragon Wagon at dndwpod.com or wherever you find great podcasts.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers, to another wonderful episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. I'm excited for this episode to invite back one of our treasured guests. He is Hank Whittemore. He is a former actor, former writer, former journalist, Emmy Award winner, I do believe, and also the author of one of my favorite Oxfordian books, 100 Reasons Shakespeare Was the Earl of Oxford. And today we're going to explore some more of those 100 reasons. Hank, welcome back to the program. So wonderful to have you back. You are one of my favorite guests for a variety of reasons. We share so much in common, our love of the theater and our background in acting and theater, and as well as our backgrounds in journalism. But also, I think we share a lot philosophically when it comes to the Shakespeare authorship question. And the last time we had you with us, we talked about some of the 100 reasons in your book, and discussed that it would be a good idea to have you come back for the future to do some more of those 100 reasons. We could probably do an entire series, of 10 episodes, 10 reasons at a time. In fact, and I remember you saying at the last time that you had probably 100 more reasons that you were going to be putting together, maybe a future version, a future edition of the book. I don't recall specifically which of the 100 reasons we covered last time. I don't think we'll be covering any of the same ones this time. I went through and chose some of the fun ones, some of the interesting ones, and some that are just near and dear to me because of my own research and my own philosophies when it comes to the Shakespeare authorship question. And so what I'd like to do is, of course, begin with reason number 3 in the book, which, as you well know, touches on my personal history as a director and actor. And that's exactly what the title of the reason is, the director-actor.
Yeah.
Tell us about the director-actor that was the Earl of Oxford.
Exactly. And, each of these, and this one is no exception, to me, they're like little pieces of magic that turned over the years, turned me on, completely one by one. Any which one would have made me an Oxfordian, I think, because you and I both, having been in Shakespeare productions, we know that that he used the stage as best as he could, including like in places like in plays like Henry V, this wooden let's imagine what we can do here, have whole battles at Agincourt, this kind of thing. He would have been a David Lean, a great, he would have used all of today's technology to encompass his own, imagination. And he would have been a master showman. So here, I come upon, and this is over a 20-year period before I even began, excuse me, a blog on this, taking up one by one. And I would remember these things. And one of them was when Oxford was 22 years old in 1572, he goes to the Warwick castle where the Queen and her entire royal court have paid a visit, and they want a big show that night. And here he is directing a great show. He's got a mock military battle in the field, and I mean, he's got two forts and battering rams in the middle. Each fort is one is headed by Fulk Greville, who's a friend of his at the time, I think a friend, and at least they're in the battle they're enemies, and each has 200 men. They have weapons of various kinds that produce balls of fire and different kinds of firework types of things. They have all the correct military names that you're going to see in Shakespeare, and on comes the battle, and it's such a wondrous thing. And of course, to me, this is like, okay, the Queen is sitting there in the court. This is like being invited by whatever president of the United States or some leader of a country saying, come to my palace, my White House, whatever, and put on the great show. And you would do it.
One of the things, it kind of, when I was reading this account, this 1572 Warwick Castle battle reenactment that Oxford staged for the Queen and her court, it actually brought to mind what I believe are reminiscences of the types of battle reenactments that occurred in Roman times before the great Caesars of Rome in the arena and in the Colosseum.
Yes.
Where they would remove the floor of the Colosseum and actually reenact naval battles on a body of water in the middle of the Colosseum floor.
Right. I found that out when I went there with my family and that was an amazing place to see where the gladiators actually, got dressed and got ready or undressed, whatever the case was, underneath. But before that, to know there was a lake and they did naval battles. That's incredible. And in this case, they were trying to, say, a mock military battle. They weren't trying to kill each other. But nonetheless, some of these fireballs and like cannonballs, I guess, went over the whole place into the town, hit 3 or 4 houses, one in which a fireball went right through the wall and out the other side and just missed a sleeping couple. And, it's amazing. The Queen came up with...
he learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of pyrotechnics gone wrong, I guess, back in the 1570s.
Can you imagine? I really think, too, there's Shakespeare's an expert on, of course, just about everything, which is a mind blower, and he's an expert on military matters. He was involved in writing plays that gave the correct kind of information, and here he had to have such information in order to have a realistic place, a battle. And so the Queen had to come up with 25 pounds to the poor people whose house got nearly blown apart, And, it was Oxford and Greville who went to save the couple. Turned out they were okay. But, they were young men who... I think they were theater people, don't you? I mean, it was theater at its best.
I've never produced a show that large. I have used pyrotechnics, but never to that extent.
Right.
And I've never had a cast of 200 actors on either side to recreate a battle. But if you think about the grand scale of that production early in his lifetime in 1572 at the age of 20 years old, and then what he later goes on to write, and some of the history plays and some of the battle scenes, and including there are wonderful battle scenes in Julius Caesar, and thus again there's that Roman history connection. It sure does paint a picture of a grand producer director in the Earl of Oxford.
Yes, and in those days they were confined to rules that Oxford as Shakespeare was breaking, and well before he became Shakespeare, I believe, in plays for the court and so on. And among those rules was some kind of unity of time and place and so on. And Philip Sidney, whose work I believe was not recognized until after he died in 1586, and he wrote some mocking stuff that became a wonderful paper delivered quite a while ago by Ramon Jimenez, in which he, in Sidney's tract, he was making fun of a play like Henry V or VI, where all these armies are supposed to be on stage and the battles taking place, but of course they weren't. And then all of a sudden, it was daytime, and then it was, the unities are broken. But this is exactly what we have today in the movies, and it's what we do in our plays as best we can. And he was already there, imagine breaking the tradition and inventing new forms. And I think that to do a live mock battle with 400 guys, 200 on each side, and really realistic and real, semi-real weapons and ammunition. Can you imagine? I mean, it cried out to write plays that could encompass this, even if they didn't, and so that's why, imagine this wooden O, and imagine the battles over here, the great army, etc. He was trying to tell people this is really this is a new form that we can imagine.
And there's a river nearby Warwick Castle where this mock battle occurred, is there not?
Yes.
And the name of that river has an interesting name, wouldn't you say?
Is it the Warwick River? I mean, what?
It is the River Avon.
Oh, the Avon. Well, the Avon's all over England. I learned that later. I mean,
and according to the chronicle that you quote here in the book, the chronicler talks about when he writes about having viewed the battle, he says here in a quote, "For the wildfire falling into the river Avon would for a time lie still, and then again rise and fly abroad, casting forth many flashes and flames, whereat the Queen's Majesty took great pleasure." I wonder if that's where our man first developed the nickname Sweet Swan of Avon.
I wonder. Why not, But look at that audience that he had. If he could delight the Queen, it was a political and a whole other levels of acceptance, right? I mean, it
beats the Academy Award. If you ask me, it sure beats getting an Oscar.
So there you have, again, I think we have three categories, basic of the reasons that we have. Factual information, right? We have somebody who's educated, knows the details of this, that, and the other. Then you have experience, right? You have actual lived experience. And then you have another kind of aspect, I think, is viewpoint or attitude, And if you add up these things, you see it all in Shakespeare. What's his attitude? What smacks of personal experience, and what smacks of real good information and learning. All three play into Shakespeare, and all three sort of branch out into these 100 reasons. In this case, I think you're combining military knowledge that he had to have, and then real experience in the tilt yard, for example. You mentioned the gladiators, well, crowds and spectacle. That's part of the court life, you know. And I believe he had a lot to do with the entertainments of the court over the years that we don't know about specifically.
Well, and for any of our theater history buffs who are listening, it also calls to mind the pageants at Abydos in Egypt that occurred thousands of years prior, where again they had these reenactments of battles and reenactments of the sacrifices of gods and the rising of gods from the ashes. And it sounds to me like our writer knew a lot of that history and had connection to a lot of that theater history that could only have come from having access to an incredible library of the time.
Yes, exactly.
Speaking of having access to an incredible library, that leads me to reason number 14.
14.
Beowulf.
Beowulf, yes.
14.
Yes.
Beowulf and Hamlet. And this one is near and dear to me because I recently gave a presentation during our fall online symposium about the importance of mentors to genius. And Beowulf connects directly to one of the Earl of Oxford's early mentors, Lawrence Noel.
Yes.
And
yes.
In fact, to this day, the Noel Codex is known for having the only extant copy that the known world has of the writing that is known as Beowulf. Explain a little bit of that for our listeners who don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, it's probably one of the very few and the oldest Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. It was set in Sweden. I think it was, Old English, right? And Beowulf is, of course, now we can read that in school and all the rest. And it's the 8th and 11th centuries, somewhere in between, 10th century, let's say. And no one had seen it in England. Oxford was 13 years old. And this was 1563. So now we're going back 9 years from the Warwick entertainment, right? And here's this kid who Noel writes a note to William Cecil, his guardian, the young lord's guardian, saying, I think I've run out of things to teach him. He already knows too much. Meanwhile, Noel's a great cartographer with maps and so on, and he is a great historian of a kind, the kind that would look at these old manuscripts. And it comes into his hands, the only one in England, in that very time period that young Oxford is his pupil, that he's privately tutoring. So can you imagine him saying, Edward, look at this. Edward de Vere, look, young Edward, at this ancient manuscript. We are the only people who have gotten to see that. And, people didn't see that for a century. And so here, number one, you have this incredible experience and knowledge. He must have devoured that manuscript, knew it by heart. And when it comes to later writing Hamlet, we have the various scenes, including the end, the dying scene, and leaving the legacy. And, I quote some of those parallels in that reason. Excuse me. And this is another reason to believe that Shakespeare was this, this young Earl. Let me take a cough here.
That's me. Noel's accomplishments are many, and his credentials are many, and that is why he ends up being trusted with this very rare, very important manuscript, the Beowulf manuscript.
Yes.
And there would have only been maybe a few people in all of England who would have had access to that manuscript. One of them would have been Noel, obviously. One of them would have been William Cecil, because Noel was under Cecil's hire to tutor the Earl of Oxford. It can be established that a tutor would share with his young genius pupil the access to this wonderful manuscript and his excitement in having obtained it. And in fact, as you said, Noel writes a letter in Latin to Cecil, basically saying, I'm no longer needed to teach Oxford. He's beyond what I can teach him. He doesn't need me anymore. And I'd like to go fix some maps and do some accurate map work and cartography for you that has been bungled by others. So please release me from my duties as tutor to the Earl of Oxford and let me go continue what I do so well. And the idea that then when you later see parallels between the content of the manuscript of Beowulf and major verses that you find in Hamlet,
yes,
to then draw the connection that the author of Hamlet must have had access to that Beowulf manuscript, it is impossible to believe that Shake-Speare of Stratford could have ever seen that manuscript, let alone perused it with his own hands, let alone committed any of it to his memory to then later use as content for a masterpiece like Hamlet.
Yes, and you and I talk about the phenomenon of the belief in the Stratford tradition, given such information, and you kind of have to imagine a scholar looking at Beowulf and looking at Hamlet, seeing these parallel passages, and kind of having to pull the blinds down and saying, let's go somewhere else because we can't deal with this. How do we explain the fact that nobody in England was really looking at this manuscript at all? But this kid did. And years later, we have a manuscript of a great play, perhaps the greatest Shakespearean play, one of the few, totally greatest, and based on partly this early experience. Everything feeds into a single work. It's not just one source, So that's the other incredible thing about Shakespeare. It's this myriad-minded author who is feeding into his work all kinds of levels of learning and experience and viewpoint. And here he could do that with the back of his hand. Take those dying speeches of Hamlet, tell my story, and it's an echo of Beowulf telling his good friend. And what's his good friend's name again? I should know that. But in any case, again, we have people over the years in our Oxfordian movement. They contributed to my book, if you will. And Andy Hannes, the late Andy Hannes, was one who did some real work on this, and I quote him in the book along with a few others. And so in each case, and you've interviewed so many of them, you have almost specialists, don't we? Earl Showerman with the Greeks, you have so-and-so with the law, and it goes on. Roger Stripmatter with the Bible and several other things of which he has become an expert, and Alexander Wall and so on. And they all contribute to these pieces of mystery and magic, I think. It's magical to think that the greatest writer of English language knew Beowulf at age 13 because he had a private tutor. He started with a private tutor at age 4, Thomas Smith. So, it was people. It took me a while to understand that when Oxford went to Cambridge and Oxford universities, he didn't really spend that much time there. He had tutors. I mean, it was not the way we go to college today. And he was 14 and 16 when he got his degrees.
Right.
And, you know, so these private tutors who were, as you say, they were among the smartest people, musicians, scientists, and so on. We'll cover some of that in these 10 reasons we're going to try to pick up today.
Well, and you know, one of the things that I did not touch on in my presentation, I mean, well, I did, but just barely, and it could become an entire second presentation, like a sequel presentation, because there are the mentors to genius, and then there are the jealous detractors of genius. And you find that, for instance, in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's life, you end up with an Antonin Scaglieri who is out to get him, who is so jealous and so envious of this brilliance that he wants to destroy it.
Yes.
Einstein ran into the same problems with some of his university professors who stifled his research and tried to crush his ability to publish any papers about what his findings were. And then, of course, we see all of the vitriol that came towards the Earl of Oxford later in his life. Early in his life, everyone wanted to foster the young, brilliant genius. Later in his life, they wanted to destroy him and stamp him out of the world.
Yes, and, you know, it makes me remember that over the years, I still don't have a total picture in my head of the Earl of Oxford, what he was like. I have so many different kinds of images, physically, attitude-wise. I would say that he probably handled himself like an arrogant king who had a great merry sense of humor. So yeah, he was a man of contradictions too, you know. He was a guy that could tell tall tales and make people hysterically laugh, you know, and just set the table on a roar, as he would say. And so it's not from somebody who hasn't been around to make up these stories and to feed in them some knowledge and all the rest. It's this kind of person who also had an attitude, didn't he? You don't get to be the Queen's favorite or you know, a guy who's up there at the court and handles himself with such it's a kind of arrogance, isn't it? It's confidence anyway, that he can.
I always draw the distinction because technically, in a dictionary definition, arrogance is a trait that belongs to someone who boasts about qualities they do not actually have.
Exactly.
As opposed to our man, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, who I like to call vainglorious because everything he boasted about was true.
Yes.
Which made him not so much arrogant, but made him very vainglorious and the envy of many.
It must have been incredible to be him, if you will, to know how many gifts you had at one time. I mean, these 100 reasons cover, you know, there's one section of 12 different kinds of knowledge, whether it's heraldry or you know, falconry or you know, medicine, philosophy. It goes on and on. And
let's get into some of those, because my next reason is reason number 23. And the title is Hawks and Women.
Yes. There's a
and having played the role of Petruchio more than once in my life in Taming of the Shrew, and also having played the role of Hamlet twice in my life, who both mention hawks and hawking with regards to women and with regards to other symbolism. I think it's interesting when we discover that the phrasing that we see in these comparisons of women to hawking and women who are unruly to what are known as haggards, which is an untrainable bird, that pop up over and over again that initiated in some of the Earl of Oxford's early writings as a great reason in reason number 20.
It's incredible, yes. Haggard is a wild, or let's say not quite fully trained or imperfectly trained bird, hawk or falcon, and both Oxford in his writing under his own name, and Shakespeare under the Shake-Speare name, Oxford under that name, they're both writing about with the same metaphor of women, certain women anyway. It's a figure of speech, and it's the first poem that Thomas Looney in 1920 seized upon in his research for that book of Shakespeare identified as having a similarity to published Shakespeare verse, and then he realizes that the whole wild, untamed bird fleeing from, shake them from his fist and let them fly, fair fools, which way they list. And then in Othello, he sees, if I do prove her haggard, though that her jesses were my dear heartstrings, I'd whistle her off and let her down the wind to play at fortune. And so Loney is, I want to read something I just marked up that that really got me for this reason. He says here, this is Thomas Looney, what we have in this instance, as a matter of fact, is a complete accordance at all points in the use of an unusual word and figure of speech. Indeed, if we make a piece of patchwork of all the passages in Shakespeare in which the word haggard occurs, we can reconstruct De Vere's single poem on women. And such an agreement that only supports us in seeking to establish the general harmony of De Vere's work with Shakespeare, but it carries us beyond the immediate needs of our argument, for it constrains us to claim that either both sets of expression are actually from the same pen, or Shakespeare pressed that license to borrow far beyond legitimate limits. In other words, plagiarized it from Oxford. That's extraordinary for him to have found, and it's there in the work. It's not just borrowing the metaphor. It's not just borrowing certain kinds of rhythms of speech and all. It's the whole package in which, as a personality trait, he's incorporated this metaphor and uses it almost naturally without having to, reach for the shelf to find out what word to use. That kind of thing.
And so one of two things is true. Either Shakespeare of Stratford somehow got a hold. Well, okay. One of three things is true. Either Shakespeare of Stratford somehow got a hold of Edward de Vere's early poems, his Juvenilia, and stole the metaphor from him, or came upon this same neologistic metaphor at the same time frame in the same area to write these plays and use that metaphor over and over again.
Well,
or Edward de Vere is the real Shakespeare, and this is one of the 100 reasons that proves that to be true.
Yes, and I think that our answer, the last one, is correct, because these come in the heat of creation. You imagine, you're writing with a quill pen on parchment, which I can hardly fathom myself, to see all that writing come out of one person with that crude kind of
my
utensil.
hand hurts just thinking about it.
Yeah, and what about rewriting and editing? But I don't think there was a lot of that. I think that he learned to write almost the way he wanted to. There were probably a lot of corrections, but not the kind that we do, and that in the heat of impulse, these metaphors came out. They didn't come out, in other words, preordained or conscious deliberation as much as part of the person, part of the actual deep character of the writer. And they say writing is you write what you know about, but you also you write what's in you. There's a lot of thought that goes into these plays, a lot of one layer of allegory upon another. But in the main, the scenes come alive because he's in the heat of creation. And if those metaphors,
I believe that
yeah.
I believe he was capable of seeing those layers of metaphor and composing verse in his mind the same way that Mozart was capable of composing orchestrations in his mind, the same way that Einstein was capable of composing physical formulas in his mind, and that these are the natural gifts of genius that these three men were given by the great creator above, who endued them with these talents, and that's something that you cannot teach, that you cannot, that all you can do is foster that. All you can do is mentor that to its greatness. You cannot create it. It can only be created by some other power.
Well said, Stephen. Really, I'd like to bottle that one, because what you've just summed up is something that goes beyond just simply us trying to say, look, Shakespeare wasn't the guy you thought he was our guy. No, we're really trying to understand the genius here. We agree with vast imagination. We agree with genius, and we're trying to fathom it. We're really looking, and we have places to look. That's the. If you could write 100 reasons why Shakespeare was Shakespeare, go ahead. You couldn't do it this way, right?
Well, and the big reason for that is, Stratfordians always argue that Oxfordians are snobs, and they don't want to believe that a commoner can rise up and become great, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's absolutely untrue.
It's the opposite.
I don't look at the life of Exactly. I don't look at the life of Abraham Lincoln and say it's impossible that a country bumpkin could grow up to be president of the United States. No, instead, I know the life of the man. I know how self-taught he was. I know what he did to put himself through law school. I know the education he obtained for himself in order to become the president of the United States one day. It's very similar with Benjamin Franklin, who was the 10th son of a giant poor family, but who was able to apprenticeship himself, obtain finances, and gain the schooling and knowledge he needed to foster his genius. And what we don't see with the Stratford man is any evidence of any fostering whatsoever.
Well, right.
What we see with Oxford is that initial seed of genius that is then placed in these particular set of circumstances that create what we now know as Shakespeare.
Again, well said. And it's painful to think that someone would think that you and I, or any of our Oxfordian friends, are actually snobs, and that's the reason we're in this. The odd thing for me, and I think it's for many of us, but in the particular, was that I got turned on to Shakespeare through Othello, and I've said this before, through Hamlet. But what I mean was I really liked the guy. I wanted to be Hamlet's friend, and it didn't really occur to me that, oh yeah, he's a prince and this and that. It wasn't that. It was I liked his character, his personality, his at the time. I too wanted to be sarcastic and be able to show up hypocrisy and illusion and falsity wherever I could find it. I was at Notre Dame, which I was losing shedding my religion, if you will, my formal religion, and trying to maintain a spirituality at the same time. And the school was giving me latitude to do that. And here we were with Hamlet. And I wasn't trying to like that character or drawn to that character because he was a prince. I hardly knew what a prince was at the time. I just liked the whole idea of Hamlet yelling at Ophelia, saying, you know, I'm not the great guy you think I was, and all this stuff. I mean,
well, and also, what does he say? The parallels to Hamlet and Oxford's early poem about women go beyond the use of the word haggard. You see Hamlet and he says to Ophelia, "Are you fair?
Yeah.
Are you wise? Are you honest? Are you fair?" Right?
Sure.
He also later says, "Frailty, thy name is woman." And here I'll read from the opening stanza of Edward de Vere's poem. "If woman would be fair and yet not fond, or that their love were firm, not fickle still, I would not marvel that they make men bond by service long to purchase their goodwill. But when I see how frail these creatures are, I muse that men forget themselves so far." If that's not early Shakespearean writing, I don't know what is, especially when you look at what Hamlet has to say about women and how consistent that thought is throughout the life of this writer.
Yeah, but it also reminds me that Shakespeare created great female characters, and from Rosalind to Portia to Gertrude herself, and so on, and he had to know and experience women of great character, force, and intelligence. That was probably the queen in many aspects, but other women of that ability, and they because they all had different characters, and he did have that feeling that women could be they call it fickle, right? He calls it fickle, but it's really changeable, not like men. Women.
There's a whole
Yeah.
There's a whole HBO series waiting to be written about the women of Shakespeare, and it can start with Edward's mother, Golding. I can't remember
Margaret
her first
Golding.
name all of a sudden. Marjorie Golding.
Mm-hmm.
Then it can go to Mildred Cecil.
Yeah.
Then it goes to Anne Cecil. Of course, the Queen is prevalent throughout. Then we go to the daughters, Elizabeth, Bridget, Susan, Bridget, Elizabeth, Susan, Bridget, I think is the correct order.
Yes, Elizabeth, and Bridget, and Susan. I think.
Yes, and then we also have Anne Vavasour,
the mistress,
and then at the end you have Elizabeth Trentham, his second wife, and that collection of women right there could become a long-running cable television series that would, I think, draw in every viewer everywhere, anywhere.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely. I mean, and you can throw in the Countess of Pembroke, who had a salon of her own, apparently, and Penelope Rich, who was Earl of Essex sister and very, very much involved with stuff. And these are all very strong women. So it's interesting. I think that a lot of his that poem that you read and is both got a sense of humor to it as well. I mean, do you think he's totally serious there, or what? I can't tell.
I'm absolutely serious. There's a television series that one of the cable outlets put out called Jamestown. And it's basically told from the perspective of a group of women who all arrive in Jamestown as brides for purchase.
Uh-huh.
And it tells this dark understory of that settlement and things that happened there based on that premise. And I think that today, especially in today's day and age, there is a stronger prevalence of telling stories from a female perspective or from the women who were involved in those stories from their points of view. And I think this is a story that could be best told from the points of view of the women who lived in the life of this man.
You've just given away the subject of a great new book. That's great.
Well, somebody please get on that, because I'm a little busy.
Oh, God.
You know, I want to go on to now reason number 30. And one of the reasons why I really cleave to this is some of the research that I have done found that the name Willie and William, used as a nickname for poets and writers, dates way back prior to Elizabethan times, and actually connects to the Greek myths of Orpheus.
Now that I did not know.
Yes, and Orpheus carries with him into the underworld not a laurel branch of Apollo, but the branch of a willow tree. And as this true bard of Greek mythology, I don't know what else you could call him, this poet musician.
Yes.
If that's not what a bard is, I don't know what is. And that later down the line, the willow tree becomes connected with poet musicians, and those who are poet musicians who carry the willow, who subscribe to the willow, became known as willies. And in reason number 30, you point out that there is a reference to our pleasant Willie, not William or Will or even Master W, but our pleasant Willie.
Very interesting.
And I'm wondering if within this reason, and where you point out what Edmund Spenser had to write about it, if Spenser isn't giving that nod to that, for lack of a better term, slang term for poets.
I believe you're right.
If our man Edward chose Willie Shakespeare, poet who shakes a spear, as his pen name, just like Mark Twain chose Mark Twain as a pen name, sort of tongue in cheek, you know.
And it came out of his actual work on the river. Yes, and you know I haven't known that. That's terrific. That's wild. I mean, Spenser seemed to know an awful lot about Oxford and the doings of the court. And, there's this one passage among many in his work that was published right after The Fairy Queen was the first part of it was published in 1590 and or in 1589 or 90. And right away came this other work of Spenser's that included Mother Hubbard's Tale and Tears of the Muses and this kind of thing. But Tears of the Muses, in this one, he's describing tears of the muses. In other words, something has gone wrong with the state of writing, of poetry and theater. And he has these 6 lines, which I like to read because they position it also in the history of that particular moment. He says, the man whom nature's self had made to mock herself and truth to imitate, with kindly counter under mimic shade, our pleasant Willie, is dead of late, with whom all jolly joy and jolly merriment is also deaded and in dolour drent. And then later on he says he's choosing to sit in idle cell that sow himself to mockery to sell. In other words, he doesn't want to sell anything. He just wants to sit there in his sell and perhaps work or be idle.
He's gone into seclusion.
Now,
what he's saying is he's saying our pleasant Willie, our pleasant poet, known as Willie, interchangeable. My argument is that the name Willie and the word poet are interchangeable.
Absolutely, I believe you're
Willie
right.
is a nickname for poets, and they're all Willies. Spencer himself is a Willie. Lily was a Willie. Kidd was a Willie. Marlowe was a Willie. Johnson was a Willie. They're all Willies.
Yes.
This particular Willie, though, has gone into seclusion and has stopped writing, stopped publishing, and it has caused particularly the muse of comedy, Thalia, to weep.
To weep.
And
exactly. And it's given Stratfordians, the traditional authorship, a real tough time because I quote here Nicholas Rowe, who really wrote the first biography, if you will, or attempt at it, of the Stratford man as Shakespeare. Just pieces of rumor, really. But he does say that Willie, in this case, such a character is described as he gives, could belong to no other dramatist of the time other than our Shakespeare. Now, the trouble is that Shakespeare in no way has been perceived as sitting in idle cell or dead of late in 1590. In fact, he was just starting out, wasn't he, on his vast, successful career.
According to the Stratford mythology,
there you go.
He hadn't even begun. He'd barely begun to write.
Now, but what really had happened, and what I think is part of this story, and I put in that reason, is that Oxford and his circle of writers in the 80s, to be brief about it, tried to help the government by turning out history plays and other forms of writing. They tried to do a couple of different things. They tried to build up nationalism and patriotism, but also to give the English and England a national identity through its own English language and literature. Well, the Armada was beaten back. That was kind of a wartime effort of the 1580s. And by the time 1590 came, the British government had no more use for the writers. They didn't like the writers, really, only when they could use them on their side. Then they loved the writers. But at this point, well, the Armada was 130 ships, etc., has been turned back. And so now we don't need them. And you find that there's kind of what I have called a bloodbath of writers. You have Marlowe killed, of course. You have Kidd dying on the rack. You have Green dying, Lodge leaving the country. You have a whole bunch of writers who are no longer functioning. And the Stratfordians love to say, well, Shakespeare had the field all to himself. Well, that's because Oxford used the pen name in 1593.
Right.
But what was happening is...
because he couldn't be held accountable for everything he was writing the way those other men that you just mentioned were accountable for what they wrote. And that's why they either ended up dead, tortured to death, or fleeing the country.
Yes. And that's, and that's why I believe the Shakespeare name partially comes from this shaking of the spear in defense of the muses, if you will, and saying, I'm here. You didn't kill me. I'm a resurrected writer who was dead, if you will, and now I'm resurrected. I'm Shakespeare, and I'm ready to go. And it's an interesting phenomenon. But so this Pleasant Willie is right at the vortex of that, combining the muses are weeping, and our great poet who made everybody laugh and had sweet music on his at the tip of his tongue is dead of late. This Oxford's experience explains it. He was being financially crushed. He was lost his Fisher's Folly or place wherever he had all these writers together. And he had achieved a great thing, I think, with them, all of them, to create what's called, I guess, the Renaissance of English drama and literature, even though I don't know what.
Their propagandic usefulness had come to an end with the defeat of the Armada. And now they continued to use their wit. They continued to use their savvy. They started to point their pens inward at their own government, at their own society, and they ended up punished for it.
Yes.
Oxford sees this happening. He's losing his cabal of writers, what have to have been his very best friends. One can't imagine that you'd spend that much time with fellows who loved and had a passion for the same thing as you, and then suddenly start to lose them all.
Yeah.
And he goes into seclusion. He's being stifled. They can't torture him. They can't put him on the rack. They can't cut off his head, but they can crush him in other ways, which they do.
Yeah.
And he goes into seclusion, and it's about 2.5, 3 years later, suddenly William Shakespeare appears.
Like out of the ground.
Ta-da!
And the government was furious. They not only in the 80s had censorship. They could destroy any press they found. They could burn a book if they wanted. But then in the 90s, they were trying to bury the theater. Robert Cecil once ordered all the playhouses to be torn down in the middle of the 90s, and there was this Isle of Dogs scandal where Nash had to flee, and Johnson was put into jail, and all the copies of that play are now lost. There was a lot of attempt by the government to censor, and this is a great story, isn't it? In a sense, the pen name comes out of a new life based on 43 years of life and writing leading up to that. See, and now you have,
and the name William Shakespeare suddenly has a whole new connotation to it, to those in the know, because here he is saying, I am Willie, I am the poet, shaking a spear like Athena, my patron goddess, at all of you, thumbing my nose at all of you, in the name of all of the Willies who came before me, who have suffered under your censorship, under your tyrannical rule.
And, to risk being, very dramatic about it and a very touching way, those writers who were still alive when Shakespeare, the pen name, came up, must have looked to each other and said, he's back. Oh my God, he's back, and there was
a cheer that went up. There was a silent cheer among the silent minority.
Yeah. It's a great classic story, isn't it? And of course, what he was also doing was rewriting, revising, refining those works written and rewritten for various reasons over the years, and then grown to maturity into finalized works of dramatic literature, as well as.
If he were living today, he'd be wearing a T-shirt that said #resist.
Exactly. So there we are.
And I petition any of our listeners who are listening who maybe have young people in their lives, and I know you do. You have a son who's about to be 18 years old,
yep,
about to venture into the world of higher academia and become an adult and come
yes,
into his own,
yep,
as they would say in Renaissance England, come into his majority, as it were.
Yes.
And I would say to our listeners, if you have a young person in your life, this is an episode to ask them to listen to, and let them listen to the resounding resistance, the subversive nature of the real Shakespeare, the rebellious nature, as it were,
yes,
and the ability to stand up to a totalitarian state in a way that was absolutely unheard of up until that time in history.
There you go.
And from a historical perspective, I think there is great relevance to some of the things that we are facing today in our own modern world and with our own modern governments and our own modern leaders. And I'll leave it at that without getting too political, but I think that that's crucially important.
Absolutely. And, it's like the press who's trying to get at the truth. And our man has a motto: nothing truer than truth. And he's constantly writing about truest things. And the truth is exactly what this government doesn't want people to know. So how does he do it? He does it in disguise, not only a disguised name, but allegory. And through, the power of allegory, that's another thing that should turn on young people. And if you want to say something really powerfully, try to find a good metaphor and an allegory, and for some reason, and whole papers should be written about the power of saying, I'm going to set this in the Danish court, but it's really going to be about England, and
well, there are entire doctoral theses about the allegorical context of Star Wars, for instance, as a point of reference.
Yeah.
And there's another one there for our listeners who have young adults in their lives or teenagers in their lives. Yes, I just made a Star Wars reference.
Yes.
And take a look. Take a look at the allegorical complexities of the Star Wars story, especially the original movie, and how it plays out systematically throughout the series of films as well. So yes, you're spot on. There's also something to be said about the stock characters that are involved in allegorical tales.
Yes.
And the fact that you have the ultra villain, you have the pure hero or the pure heroine. You have the knavish sort of capitano, if you will, of the Millennium Falcon. You have the dottore of C-3PO, for instance. And if you can see where I'm going here, I'm going to reason number 46. Yeah. Reason number 46, commedia dell'arte.
It's an amazing thing because Oxford spent more than a year in Italy and made his home base in Venice, and he would have seen and witnessed, these traveling troops of stock characters, like you say, actors who played these amazingly exaggerated, but underneath telling the truth, right? So he imported this traveling Italian form of street art that was unknown in England until much, much later. And so we find lots of parallels. And I was amazed to know that in the research, Paul Altrocchi's mother, Julia, in the 50s uncovered a book in Italy, in Venice, I think it was in Venice anyway, that told a story of how one of the tirades, how do you pronounce that in Italian? Tirade. They would give there was one particular fantastical character.
Different context than what we know the word today, though, right? Like the tirata.
Yeah. And
you're talking about the tirata, which is a long speech of condemnation, but comedic condemnation,
funny.
Sort of like a roasting.
Yeah,
sort of like a roasting of people, and you see that in Shakespeare a lot. You see tirata happening in Shakespeare all over the place. Even in some of the history plays where you have characters that go on these long
yes.
Monologues that are poking at various players and oftentimes players in the play that actually represent players in the court. And it's our guy using his quill mightier than the sword to stab at his enemies and opponents in politics. But I think what you're referring to is this tirata that actually references the Earl of Oxford and sticks a quill or two in him in the middle of this Italian commedia play.
Yes, and with the experience of apparently in full understanding that this great lord of the High English court, had a great sense of self humor against himself. He could make fun of himself. And my Lord of Oxford in this tirade is mentioned, and they get on. He gets on a horse with another lady, and they end up falling into the dust with each other, and into great hysteria. And Oxford must have been just it was the other side of being a noble who, as Oxford had put it in a letter, a hater of ceremonies. He was a lover of the arts and wild humor and all of that. And I was amazed too by one of our other experts, Richard Whalen and Ren Dreyer, who write that the underpinning of the first scenes of Othello are based on commedia dell'arte. Othello's a tragedy, but it does take a place in Italy, and sure enough, Brabantio, the father who's saying his daughter has been taken, and all of this is giving a tirade, a tirata, and
I think it's wonderful that in the imagery, and again that the metaphor, and these were all like. One of the keys to fantastic rhetoric is the mastery of metaphor. Aristotle himself said that one of the keys to genius was the use of metaphor to prove a point or convince an argument.
Yeah.
And we've lost a lot of that skill and talent in the modern age of mostly images rather than words. But here in this speech that is documented, this tirata in this commedia production that mentions Oxford, it says that he rode a fawn-colored horse named Ultramarine, which means beyond the sea. So he's not only acknowledging that he is the Lord of Oxford, but that he has come from beyond the sea.
Yeah.
And he is wearing a violet colored costume, not purple,
Violet,
but as close to purple as you can get, without crossing the bounds of royalty, right?
Exactly.
And carrying a very large sword. And in commedia, characters that carried very large swords was representative of phallus.
Yeah.
And so here he is, the Lord of Oxford, arriving on a horse from beyond the sea, dressed almost like royalty, with this giant phallus, wielding it around, waving it at everyone. And remember, he is the guy who showed up in the square and said, "I will take on any challengers. I dare you."
He did that. That's
and
right.
If that's not vainglorious, I don't know what is.
Here he's 25. It's 3 years after that Warwick entertainment with the mock battle. Now he's in Italy, and he's obviously delighted with the commedia dell'arte and probably made fun of himself. And they know he's a great lord and all this, and challenged on behalf of his queen, all comers to a duel, right? With his sword.
He must have laughed hysterically at watching this performance occur before him, because it goes on to say that he then tilted against Alvilda, the Countess of Edinburgh, who apparently was mounted on a dapple gray, meaning a mare, not a great stallion.
Yeah.
And was armed with a Frankish lance, meaning inferior to the English, of course, while robed in lemon color. And in the end, the two of them threw one another simultaneously off their horses, both landing face down in the dust. In other words, rolling around together in the hay.
There you go.
That's the way I read it.
There you go.
And I believe that's exactly how it was meant. And knowing how bawdy commedia is, here was a writer who had heard what had happened between these two people of nobility from foreign lands and personified it in front of an audience, including them, probably a little bit to their embarrassment, but also to their humor.
Incredible, huh? Incredible. And, there's the many sides of one man. There's just one of the many. because at the same time, he's studying the ghetto and the Shylock kind of area with the Jews are locked in at night, and he's understanding all of that, including Jewish law, so he can actually write The Merchant of Venice. And he's probably, as we have learned, on very big state, trying to find matters of state that deal with different diplomatic things and in state intelligence for the Queen. So it's a number of things.
Elizabeth definitely sent him there for a reason.
Yeah.
There's no doubt, especially since he fled once before and she called him immediately back because he left without her permission. This time she gives him permission. She sends him not straight to Italy, but through France, across the Alps into Italy, and allows him to stay there for, I think it's 15 months.
Mm-hmm.
Before ultimately calling him home. And then, of course, as we all know, on the way home, he gets abducted by, pirates. P.S. Pirates. That's one of the 100 reasons I know, but not one we're going to cover today because we've covered it in so many other episodes. But yes, ladies and gentlemen, pirates, Hamlet, pirates. That should be reason number 1 and reason number 100 again, just to reiterate.
And we've only touched on 5, haven't we?
We have only touched on 5, and we have already filled this 1 hour episode. We have more than filled this 1 hour episode. So I'd like to ask your indulgence, Hank, because I have another 5. I chose 5 from the first 50, and I chose 5 from the second 50 of the 100 reasons. So I'd like to ask you, could we close this episode as part 1 and do a second episode as part 2 and ask our listeners to come back 2 weeks from now and listen to the next episode? What do you say?
We could do that. Sure. Absolutely.
Because I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and I had a feeling this might happen, that it would take us longer to get through 5 than I originally thought. Always better to have more material than not enough. But I think our listeners would be glad to wait. Each episode podcast comes out every 2 weeks. So I think our listeners are clued into that. They know to expect that. And what a great teaser that we can give them right now and say 2 weeks from now, ladies and gentlemen, we will go into 5 more reasons from 100 Reasons Shakespeare Was the Earl of Oxford by Hank Whittemore. And he'll be back for another episode. And we'll call it part 2, which would actually be part 3 because we covered some reasons in a much earlier episode about a year ago.
I forget. Yes.
Right. It has been some time, but I don't see any reason why we can't make this a 2-part series for Don't Quill the Messenger. And with that said, we'll ask Hank to return for another episode. So stay tuned for that in 2 weeks. In the meantime, we want to remind you that wherever you are streaming from, we hope that you will give us a rate and a review. We hope that you will share the podcast with others. Pick your favorite episodes, the ones that you think will resound with those people around you who are curious about your new discovery or long time passion about the Shakespeare authorship question. And we believe that this podcast series is one of the best ways to introduce people to this topic. And it's accessible. It has a variety of topics. We're now approaching close to 50 episodes on record. And so you can choose the various different expertise and specialties of our guests that are all listed there on the website. And if you just send a link to somebody through an email or through a social media post and say, hey, I found this, check it out. Or, hey, this might interest you, check it out. We would love to have you share us with others. We get emails all the time from folks who listen to us while they're exercising, listen to us while they're in the car commuting, listen to us when they just want to get away from the other craziness of the world, while they're jogging, while they're working on their car, whatever it is that you do. We're so thankful to be a part of that and have us share with you by being in your ear or in your speaker at the time. And we sure would love it if you would share us with others. We thank you for joining us. Stay tuned in 2 weeks for episode 2 of more of the 100 Reasons Shakespeare Was the Earl of Oxford. Thank you, Hank, for joining us today, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
You bet.
Don't forget, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.